Good morning. I'm Carol Busey, and I feel like I'm related to about half of you now because some of you have heard me speak so many times. I'm very flattered that you are here yet again today for this class. For those of you, I think there may be one or two people here who've actually taken it 7 or 8 times. But, you know, I kind of look at it like going to a revival. You know what there's going to be said at a revival, but you just like to hear it again. So it is an honor for me to be able to do this. It is truly for me a labor of love. I love getting prepared for this. I love learning new things from people who are in these classes. And, you know, I love digging up something new that I haven't learned before and saying, oh, they're just going to love this. So welcome. And some of you know that I tend to, what would my husband say, wax loquacious. I talk too much and too long. And so if, in fact, we run out of time at the end for questions and answers, you can email me. See, there is my email address, Carol with an E on it. My mother put it on, so you have to, at Busey@nashville.gov, and I will be happy to answer any of your questions. If you see the maps and you want copies of the maps, I can email you the maps and other things as well. And the sources are, all the images are open source. I've got the sources up here, but I can tell you where I found the sources for the images that I'm using in these classes. But Nashville is a wonderful city in which to live. The history of this city is truly glorious, and so it's my great honor to serve as the county historian and to be able to present this material to citizens in really all parts of Davidson County. Now, here we go. I was afraid the thing was not going to work today. So this is the plan that I have for these classes, and we'll see how well this works. It worked pretty well in February at Green Hills. Today we're going to talk about the beginnings of Nashville history, and then we'll move in to Nashville becoming a frontier town, the age of Jackson, his ascendancy to the national stage. We'll talk more about Jackson on the third session and how Nashville was growing. Does growth sound like a familiar theme? It is. And then we'll get us up to the Civil War, but we will not talk about the Civil War. The Civil War, Nashville's history is so interesting and it related to the Civil War, and we really need a whole 4 sessions for that. Now, some of you are already aware that we're going to do the same thing, but Nashville 102 in September at the Metro Health Department, and those classes will be at the same time but on Monday. And if you've never been to the Metro Health Department, Lentz Center over on Charlotte, it is a new building. It is really lovely. It has lots of flat parking and easy access. So I hope that if you're interested in the second half, we'll pick up in the second half right after the Civil War, and then we'll save the Civil War for another day. So thank you all for coming. And I really believe that history, in order to understand history, you've really got to understand the land. The land came first, and then came people. And so as you see from this map here, you see that dark green area in the middle of the map. That is the central basin, which I generally call the Cumberland Basin. The Cumberland River crosses the central basin. Now, it is surrounded by a lighter green area that is the Highland Rim. And the Highland Rim is like a soup bowl. It's a bowl with a rim, and we sit down in the bottom. Now, the Highland Rim crosses out here at the edge of Bellevue, and so part of Bellevue is actually on the Highland Rim, and part of it is not. It's very difficult for me when I come out here or when I take I-40 west going from Nashville to Jackson or Memphis to find the Highland Rim on this side of Davidson County. But I can always find it if I take the old highway, the old Clarksville Highway, up to Joelton, if I'm going up to Joelton to speak, because the ridge is very pronounced up there, Paradise Ridge, and I can always find it there. But we are sitting in the Central Basin, and we have easy access to a lot of things here thanks to the Cumberland River. So in order to really understand how the people got here, and I'm talking about all the people, the Native Americans and others as well, you really have to take a look at not only the Cumberland River, but the Cumberland River's tributaries. Now here you see the Cumberland River, the most prominent river on our map here, and you notice all of these bends in the Cumberland River. The Cumberland River, let's go back to this map, it begins over in the eastern foothills of the Appalachian Mountain in the state of Kentucky. It comes down into Tennessee, there where Dale Hollow Lake is, meanders across between Trousdale County and Wilson County, Sumner County and Wilson County, and then it crosses into Davidson County. And this area, before the Europeans came, when Native Americans were here coming in and out hunting, this area, by all descriptions, was a paradise. It had a tremendous amount of wild game and birds, as well as things such as buffalo. Hard to imagine buffalo roaming here in Nashville today, isn't it? But it had a vast amount of animals living here or coming in and out. Now, what about the Cumberland Basin attracted these animals? What attracted these animals was the fact that this basin, which is made out of limestone, has lots of spots where salt comes naturally up out of the ground. The early people call these things salt licks because the animals would come in and lick the salt out of the water there. And Davidson County, Sumner County, Robertson County, Wilson County are filled with these salt licks. Indeed, that was the actual spot that James Robertson picked out when he decided to relocate over here. But the Native Americans had been coming here for a long time, and as you can imagine, the animals had made trails, and then the Native American tribes made trails, and soon you have actually some pretty easy paths to follow in and out. I'm really intrigued by all of these bends in our river and all of the tributaries, and we learned a lot about the Cumberland River in 2010 when we had the flood. So I hope we don't need to learn too much more about where it floods. Here is a close-up of the Cumberland River here, and you see the bends were actually named for people who bought the land or claimed the land in those bends. Starting over here with Bell's Bend, still some farms in Bell's Bend and Cockrell Bend. Bell's Bend, Cockrell Bend, and White's Bend, along with down the Nolensville Pike, were really some of the most important dairy farming production in the United States at the turn of the 20th century. There were dairy farms all over Bell's Bend, Cockrell Bend, down Nolensville Road. There were a number of dairy farms down there. And so it's really, those areas are kind of the last completely underdeveloped part of Davidson County. Now, as you go around there in that big bend there, that is where downtown Nashville is today. I'll show you. It sits on the western side of the Cumberland River as it's flowing for the moment. Well, it's actually flowing north there, but it's flowing, it goes from your right over to your left and then crosses over and it will make its way to the Ohio River, and then to the Mississippi, and then into the Gulf of Mexico. This is a kind of an interesting thing, I think, to consider these rivers, because until you really start really looking at maps, you really don't realize that the Tennessee River makes a big U. It starts over in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. It is officially begins just above Knoxville, where the Holston and French Broad rivers come together to create the Tennessee River. The Clinch River and Powell River will flow on a little bit further, but it makes this big dip down into the state of Alabama, and then it's sort of meandering, I guess I would call that northwesterly there in Alabama, and that is where the Muscle Shoals are. Now, we talk about Muscle Shoals, Alabama all the time, but I've found that very few people living in Tennessee know what a shoal is. It is a place where water comes up very near the surface. Underneath this water, there are rocks that are very near the surface of the water. So, of course, for boating, this is extremely hazardous. There were shoals, predominant shoals on the Watauga River in East Tennessee. Further down the river towards Ashland City, there were some very prominent shoals. They're still there, but the water is deeper, of course, because of the dams. There were Harpeth shoals there, and we had a couple of really bad steamboat wrecks there at the Harpeth shoals as a steamboat was coming upstream from Paducah to Nashville, and it hit those rocks. And one person that had to get rescued from a steamboat accident coming, he was leaving Nashville going downstream, was none other than General Lafayette when he had come to visit Andrew Jackson in 1828. So this was the area that people of all ethnicities wanted to find. And the native peoples had been coming through here for thousands and thousands of years. Here we have a map. You see those dots. This is out of a book called Tribes That Slumber by Madeline Nieberg, who is deceased now, but she taught at UT in the archaeology department for many years. And all of those black dots on that map are where there were actual woodlands and Mississippian era Indians had enclaves or towns in those spots. And we really weren't paying much attention at all to the early people when the settlers, mostly Scots-Irish, mostly your ancestors, who came in 1779 and 80, and this big wave of people living here actually was established with the town of Nashville. So for the longest time, people here were busy building. They were industrious people who wanted to really make a life for themselves, and they wanted to make money along the way. And we didn't really pay much attention to the native people at all. They were pushed out, and that was kind of the end of the story. Well, a Civil War general came down here and was stationed in Nashville during the Civil War. He was with the Union Army. The Union Army came in and took Nashville very early in the war, and the military objective of the Army of Tennessee from that point forward was to liberate Nashville from the Confederate Army of Tennessee was to get the Union Army out of Nashville. It was never retaken. The Union Army controlled Nashville throughout the war. And so one of these people was Gates Thruston, and he was a lawyer by trade. He went back home to Ohio after the war was over, but he remembered that he kind of liked it down here. So he came back. He was a lawyer. He set up a law practice here. He was also very lucky in that he was able to marry one of the lovely girls here in Nashville, Ida Hamilton, so he married a lovely Nashvillian and settled down here permanently. Well, he was one of these people who I think probably got bored rather easily. He was a person who he practiced law for a good bit of time, and then he was in the insurance business for a time, but his real passion was archaeology. And the field of archaeology had not really been developed at all until really the 1870s and 80s. And we had the first folks coming down here kind of looking around. They were coming from Harvard, from the Peabody Museum in Harvard, looking at these Indian mounds. And the first of these folks that we know that came in to see what was here came in 1879. Think about that. And they found just a treasure trove all over Tennessee. So many of the Tennessee early artifacts are up in Cambridge, Massachusetts today. They got here first, and they found a lot of things. So I think that probably Gates Thruston's encounter with them probably said, well, hey, you know, I need to pay attention to this. He got very interested. And like a lot of people who collect things, once you start collecting things, it becomes, you know, the pursuit is so much of the activity. You are so excited to find something else. So he started looking at these stone graves. He was finding, the archaeologists from Harvard had started these stone box graves. And there'd been an archaeologist here of sorts. He was a judge. He was a lawyer too. Well before the Civil War, Judge John Haywood, but he had really written some books about the native peoples he thought were here, but nobody pursued him and built up on his work. And so his work had kind of gotten forgotten. And here comes Gates Thruston, who starts looking around downtown. It's hard for us to imagine downtown Nashville not being paved everywhere, isn't it? But he started looking around down there along Market Street and Water Street where the river is, and he found that the whole side of Nashville, Nashville was on the west side of the river, Edgefield on the eastern side of the Cumberland River here. And he found that Nashville was built on top of 4 big burial mounds of these stone box people. And he started doing a little literal digging, and he came up with all sorts of things. Here you see 2 things that he found here, and this bird effigy pipe is particularly interesting because that kind of stone came from somewhere up in the Midwest. So somehow there had been a lot of trade going on between the Native American people, particularly the woodland people and the Mississippian people, and trading had taken place here in one way or another. He had a very large collection upon his death. He left it to Vanderbilt University, and Vanderbilt then in the 1980s very wisely put his entire collection on a permanent loan at the Tennessee State Museum. And so if you go to the State Museum, and I really, really want to encourage every one of you to go down there, it is magnificent. It is something we should be so proud of. Our new museum, it is right there across the parking lot from the farmer's market. There's lots of flat parking. The building and the exhibits are spectacular. So just go down there and walk around for a little bit and then go back another day and walk around a little bit more. It's free, so I encourage all Tennesseans to take advantage of the bounty there. Yes?
Was it Thruston that left it or Haywood?
Oh, no, it was Thruston. Thank you for asking that question. Yeah, it was Gates Thruston that left the collection. Judge Haywood did not really have a collection, but he had found these stone box graves, and this is a kind of an interesting thing about Judge Haywood. He had been a judge in North Carolina and had gotten into some financial trouble, so he moved over here. And this is about the time of Andrew Jackson. He was a contemporary of Andrew Jackson, maybe even James Robertson. And he came over here, as I heard one lawyer say, moving to Tennessee was the nation's first form of bankruptcy. You get in financial trouble in North Carolina, and then you just move over here to Tennessee. So John Haywood became a judge here, and he lived out off of Nolensville Road. He had a big plantation of sorts out there, by all accounts, a very nice house. And he got interested in what he called the Aboriginal people of Tennessee, and he wrote the Aboriginal history of Tennessee. So he looked at these stone box graves, which are just, it is a grave, imagine a sort of rectangular hole in the ground that is lined with stones on the top, but they're not stones on the bottom. And he found these skeletons in there, and he determined that the first people here living here in Middle Tennessee were pygmies, because the graves were about this size. But what he neglected to really understand was that they were all buried with their knees up to their chest, and so he just assumed that the bones had been moved in the covering the bones with the dirt, and so he concluded that the people here were pygmies. And so this, if you look at the Aboriginal history of Tennessee, which is in the cabinet under lock and key down at the downtown Nashville room, it's interesting to look at the drawings in there of the pygmies. Now, he also had heard this legend from up in Sumner County about a man named Thomas Sharp Spencer, whom they called Bigfoot. And of course, people had no way to measure somebody's feet in 1770 when they're out here in the frontier. But people believed that he had these very enormous feet, and so that got translated by Judge Haywood into giants. And so the area was covered with pygmies at one point and giants at another. And I'm sure those Scots-Irish folks, who were most of the Europeans that settled here, they were not big people. Look at those, go out to the Hermitage and look at those outfits of General Jackson. You know, General Jackson was supposed to be really tall, and I think he was really tall in comparison to the other people that were living here, but he was tiny, comparatively speaking. The diet had a lot to do with how tall you got. So they just started looking at these Indian mounds, and there was a lot of digging. Archaeologists, professional archaeologists were coming in all the time after Thurston got his collection going, and they found all of these mounds. Well, you know, then sort of everything becomes an Indian mound. Like, for example, someone told me once that the state capitol was built on an Indian mound. Well, that's not really true, but anytime you see a hill, you conclude, oh, must be an Indian mound. So, alas, a little 12-year-old boy in the summertime was riding his bicycle out in the area of Brick Church Pike, just north of the city of Nashville. And he got out there and just was kind of up there on the top of one of these mounds, and look at what he found. He found these kinds of things, and so of course, immediately, all the archaeology people in town were swarming out there to these Brick Church mounds, because amazingly the people from Harvard and Gates Thurston had not found these mounds or knew anything about them. So there's been a lot of excavation in recent years. And another service that the Tennessee state government provides us that we don't really think about very much is the state archaeology department. And there are several first-rate archaeologists working for the state of Tennessee, and they go out anytime a road is cut in a new area. They go out and do excavations where roads are going to be located in Tennessee, and they really do excellent work. I've heard them present at several academic conferences. But here you see what these little graves were like. And the Department of Archaeology still continues to find things of this nature. And this one right here shows you a little bit better how somebody could make the conclusion that they were pygmies, because they literally, the graves were never more than 36 to 48 inches long, more like 36. And so people concluded these were very small people. These graves were found fairly recently out in Brentwood, right there behind the REI store, that Williamsburg development out there. These were found out there, and they are still turning up all over the place. They are finding these stone box graves. So we know that there were people living here during the Mississippian era. But something happened in the Mississippian era, and we are not quite sure what. Was it overpopulation? Did they not have food? Were there wars? What happened? We don't know, but by the time the Europeans first came into Tennessee, there were no native people living here in Davidson County. The Shawnee, as you see here from the middle of the map, who were living above the Cumberland River, were pushed out of this area where we are by the Chickasaws over in West Tennessee, the Cherokees over in East Tennessee, and the Creeks were down here in Alabama. So the Shawnee had been pushed out before anybody came in and actually settled from Europe, anybody that was from Europe. John Edgerton had a lovely description of this area, which some of the native peoples called Warioto, a region of primeval beauty, an undisturbed wilderness garden of nature, and many besides the Shawnees coveted it. And that is exactly right. The other tribes wanted to use this and did use it as a hunting ground. They were in and out of here quite regularly because the hunting was so great. The French came in as the first of the Europeans to officially set foot in Davidson County, as far as we know, and they called the Cumberland River La Rivière des Shawnees, and they call it the River of the Shawnees, but they did not encounter the Shawnees here. They had encountered the Shawnees further up close to the Ohio River. We believe that Martin Chartier was the first of the French to come in. The French were traders. Let's think for a minute about the history of the settlement of North America. You have the Spanish coming in to the Caribbean and claiming Central and South America. You have the French following the Spanish, but they go up into the St. Lawrence Seaway, and they will claim what we call Canada as New France. The British are the last to get here because they were having a variety of religious and political problems, but the British will get here last, and they will take the least desirable of the land, the eastern seaboard on the Atlantic Ocean of what is now the United States. And the reason they really came in the first place was to set up some outposts where their pirates could raid the ships of the Spanish, because Spain became the wealthiest nation in the world as a result of the exploits of the conquistadores that came and conquered Central and South America. The French came, and they did not find gold or wealth of that nature, mineral wealth, in Canada, but what they did find was another lucrative business, and that was the fur trade. It seems that in the 1600s, beaver fur was all the rage in Europe, and there were beavers abundantly all over Canada. And so French traders came in, and with both the Spanish conquistadores and the French traders always came Catholic priests. And so the traders and the priests would often travel, and they would often start coming down the rivers from Canada, chief of which would be the Mississippi River. And so, as it was, the French population of Canada grew rather slowly because they didn't really bring women over here and bring entire families. But what the French did do, unfortunately for them, was to overkill the beaver. You know, and this is right here, when you start trading with the Europeans as a tribe, you start to lose your independence. Because, for example, the tribes that were living in Canada, killing an animal was sort of a sacred rite, and every part of that animal was used. But now that there is such a demand for these beaver fur, they are killing the beaver, and soon there will not be any beaver left, and they're wasting the meat, the bones, all of that is wasted. And so as the beaver population of Canada begins to severely diminish, you're going to see French traders coming down the Mississippi River looking for other trading partners, because the furs down here are not going to be as good as beaver fur, nice long hair up in Canada, but still they're furs, and furs are furs, and we'll trade them and get something for them. So when Martin Chartier came down, he was looking for some furs to be able to trade and take back to a French settlement in Illinois to sell. The name that we know more than Martin Chartier is Timothy de Montbriam, because Timothy de Montbriam came in and out as a trader. He was French. He came in and out many different times, and he ended up, after Nashville was settled by the English settlements, he ended up living here, operating a store for a while, and he had a large number of children, and their descendants are still here. I had a man in one of my history classes at Volunteer State just last semester whose name was de Montbriam, and he was one of the descendants of this, and he was 60 years old, but the Tennessee Reconnect, he had never finished his college education, and he lacked 2 courses having an associate's degree. So he was in my class to take it, and it was delightful to have him because he had a lot of knowledge about Timothy de Montbriam. But de Montbriam, there's a lot of legends that go with him as well. If you've ever walked the Greenway in Shelby Bottoms, you know that part of it goes along the Cumberland River, and when the vegetation is dormant, you can see across the river over to the Omohundra Water Treatment Plant, and there is a cave. There are lots of caves in Davidson County. Davidson County, because of this Cumberland Basin in the limestone, is covered with caves, but there's a cave over there, and the de Montbriam children's legend was that's where Timothy de Montbriam lived and left one of his Indian wife. He, I think, had over the period of time about 3 wives, but you need to fact check that. I might be wrong about how many wives he had. But, I rather seriously doubt that a woman was left there by herself and gave birth in a cave. But nonetheless, legends abound about all of these people. So he met and interacted quite a lot with James Robertson over the years because he was here. And so as a result of this, that by 1769, this spot was identified and known as the French Lick because of this salt that comes up out of the ground. And to be more precise, to pinpoint the French Lick, if you know where the Bicentennial Mall is, the actual place where the water and the salt came out of the ground is right there at the Bicentennial Mall. There was a creek that flowed from the Bicentennial Mall to the Cumberland River, which isn't more than a quarter of a mile. It's now under a conduit, but that was how the further traders and then the settlers, such as the Robertsons, were able to keep coming back to the same spot. So he named it the French Lick, and thus it was called. And it is a beautiful river. Anytime you have a chance to go on one of those boat cruises of the Cumberland, I highly recommend it. There is a man, I can't remember his name, but he offers a fall leaf tour down to the Harpeth River and back, and it really is quite scenic and lots to see. I took these pictures when I was standing on the pedestrian bridge over the Cumberland River that runs from Shelby Bottoms to Two Rivers Park, and as you see, it was in the winter. Now, let's get the English over here, because it is their settlement people that are going to be the ones that are going to actually claim this area ultimately. The Cherokees were on this side of the mountains primarily. The English settlements were on the eastern side of the Appalachian Mountains. But people got curious about what was over here, and they started coming across the mountains, mainly because the population is growing, and these are always people who are looking ahead. And so a lot of these people end up becoming land speculators, because the idea is you get land free if you take it from the Indians, or cheaply, and then you will keep it for a while and use that land as capital to sell it later. Because unlike the Spanish and the French settlements, the English settlements, once they got started, they really thrived, and the population grew exponentially. The people who came into Jamestown were a bunch of men, and so their population didn't grow as rapidly as New England, where entire congregations of separatists, that would be the Pilgrims who wanted to separate from the Church of England, and Puritans who just wanted to purify the Church of England. They wanted to just take over the Church of England, in other words, make it less Catholic as they saw it. They brought entire families, so the population of New England grew rather rapidly. But Virginia finally gets established, and we have a lot of movement towards the Appalachian Mountains in all of the colonies. And Alexander Cumming had come over, and he decided he wanted to investigate the Cherokees. He was interested in the people. And so he persuaded a group of Cherokee warriors to go back to London with him to meet the members of Parliament and to just as what I might call a cultural exchange. So indeed, a group of Cherokee warriors went to London in 1730, and then they returned home. And I'm sure all of this encounter with the Europeans was both exciting and perplexing for the native people, because even when Columbus and his crew got here, you know, the Indians, although Columbus wrote in his diary that they thought we were gods, no one in Columbus's party spoke the native languages on those islands of Hispaniola in the Caribbean, and so nobody really knew what they thought of them. But from the perspective of what we know, they thought these Europeans were harmless because they were dirty, they didn't shave, they were nasty, and they posed no threat. But what no one could figure out was that those Europeans were carrying germs for which they were immune. The Europeans had immunities to, and the native peoples did not. And so almost immediately, the population of the native peoples in North, Central, and South America began to just be decimated. Some estimate 75% of the native peoples died from what is called virgin soil epidemics. You catch the germs because they've been passed through the soil without contact with a European. And so large percentages of these tribes, which was incredibly destabilizing for these tribes. So here we've got some interaction between English-speaking people and the Cherokees. And more English-speaking people will come from Virginia across the mountains. They identify a place where you can get through the mountains, a low place, a gap, or a pass, and it is named for the Duke of Cumberland, who is the brother to the king. It is named there, and this is where Europeans will start coming through this Cumberland Gap into the river that they have also named for the Duke of Cumberland, the Cumberland River, which, as I mentioned earlier, begins in the foothills of eastern Kentucky. So soon more and more of these folks are coming across, and they are coming as hunters, but soon to follow will be families looking for opportunity. It was opportunity that brought these folks here. And so, you know, a group that kind of gets into the Settlement Act fairly late are the Scots-Irish. And the Scots-Irish were people who had lived in Scotland. The English had sent some of them over to Ireland to quell some of the religious unrest in Ireland. The Scots-Irish did not particularly like the English because they had become Presbyterians. That's a version of Calvinism that was kind of tightened up a little bit by John Knox, a Scottish priest. And they didn't have money, so many of these folks came as indentured servants. And they had, in the beginning, began coming into Pennsylvania. We know that there are 4 distinct waves of Scots-Irish settlers who came in through Philadelphia, and as indentured servants, they began working their contracts off and moving towards the Appalachian Mountains, moving westward, looking for opportunities. The Long Hunters were in and out for a good long while before the settlers, but each time Long Hunters came, the Long Hunters took note of what was here, where the hills were, where the rivers were, where the creeks that flowed into the rivers were. They were making mental notes. Now, this is a mural down at the Tennessee State Capitol, another lovely place to visit. It is up on the ceiling right above the visitor's desk there in the middle of the Capitol building. And this is one of those frescoes, oil paint on wet substance, plaster. And this one is in every way inaccurate. This is somebody who watched too many Westerns, because as you see, we seem to need always to put feathers on Indians' heads. I do not know why. Some of it was accurate, but most of them are not accurate. And you see these people riding horses and galloping through the conquering of the West, but this was done without regard to historic accuracy, and it's a very large fresco. It's in really lovely shape. So the English began coming in, and they're looking around at the land. James Needham and Gabriel Arthur came in. They did a little mapping. Others come in as Long Hunters, and they will do a little mapping. If you want to read one really good book about the settlement of Middle Tennessee and the entire Cumberland River area, read Seed Time on the Cumberland, which is on my bibliography that you should have gotten when you came in, but it's at the door when you leave. The Seed Time on the Cumberland, and her second book is Flowering on the Cumberland by Harriet Simpson Arno. These are magnificent books about the people here, the people coming in, and what they found. The long-hunting soldier, farmer, explorer was an unloved figure. Washington praised his skill with the long rifle, but found him difficult. He didn't mind fighting, he hated soldiering, and had an innate distaste for drills. Standing army and all other aspects of the military life. New Yorkers and New Englanders found him, the long hunter, uncouth and even silly with his long shirt and rifle-barreled firelock, even though Boston made him very welcome as long as he was needed. The British hated borderers, for they found the shirt-tail men with their cursed twisted guns the most fatal widow and orphan makers in the world. Now, she is talking about the Scots-Irish who are going to ultimately get here and stay. But it is these two books are lovely books, and they really give great descriptions of daily life. It's not military history. So here on this map of how the ethnic settlement of the 13 colonies is, you can see a very direct line of immigration from Pennsylvania, from Philadelphia there on the Atlantic Ocean, and westward to approximately where Pittsburgh is today, and then that line right down the top of the Appalachian Mountains here into the state of Tennessee. There were several distinct waves into into Philadelphia of Scots-Irish, and one came into North Carolina. But they came here and they prospered. And going back to Harriet Simpson Arno's quote about they didn't much like military drills, you know, Tennesseans in general don't much like to follow rules. And, you know, we don't much like taxes either. So that's our Scots-Irish heritage. Now, the American colonies grew slowly, geographically speaking, but population-wise, they soon were bursting at the seams. And so we have a collision with the French, who were claiming the entire Mississippi River Valley. A river valley is the area on either side of a river where all the water flows to that river, the tributaries and all the creeks and streams that flow in. And so the blue area was what the French were claiming as the Mississippi River Valley, and they weren't looking to populate it, they were just looking for trading partners. And the Spanish were down here in Mexico and Florida. Well, we're going to have a collision right there where Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania is. The French had built a trading post there that they were calling Fort Duquesne. But some enterprising brothers living in Virginia wanted to create a land speculation company, the Ohio Land Company, and so they sent their little brother over to the Appalachian Mountains, the Allegheny and Monongahela area, to do some surveying, and what he encountered was the French and their buddies, the Indians, who certainly liked the French more than they liked the English settlers, because the English settlers were taking their land so rapidly. So they chased Little Brother and his surveying crew out. Little Brother happened to be George Washington, and it was a major military learning experience for him, because that was what really began the French and Indian War. And when the British won the French and Indian War, they were given all of the French holdings in North America. The islands in the Caribbean, the French kept their islands, but the French were pushed off of the continent, and so now Great Britain, come the end of the French and Indian War, 1763, that's just a few years before 1776, and you know what happened that year. The British have an empire now that's twice as big as it was before. They've spent a lot of money on this war, and you know what happens after the war, the French and Indian War ended. There's just kind of a series of one thing after another, with Great Britain and Parliament trying to exert a little more control over their colonists over here, and the colonists not liking their taxes raised, not liking having British soldiers here. All of those things led to the Declaration of Independence. And so in 1783, we will become the United States. But now, people had already started living here right after the French and Indian War. It ended in 1763. The British, hey, we won, but we've got to get some control over there. And so Parliament and King George III drew a line down the top of the Appalachian Mountains, that red line you see on the map here. It is called the Proclamation Line, Proclamation of 1763. One of their big expenses was defending their colonists from Indian attacks, because the colonists were provoking the Indians by wanting more land, and the Indians were trying to keep the colonists from spreading further and further west. So Parliament thought that drawing this line would be a good idea. You have your settlers on the eastern side of the line, and we will reserve all of that land west of the line. We will reserve it for the Indians, thus the term Indian Reservation. And this did not work from day one. It simply was too much to ask, I suppose, of these teenage children, the colonists, the colonies, who were accustomed to rebelling a lot, as teenagers are prone to do. So the American Revolution is on its way, but it hasn't come yet. And you see what North Carolina's claiming and what Virginia's claiming all the way to the Mississippi River. That is what they are claiming there. Now, here is James Robertson. He was a Scots-Irish. He, I think, had been born in Virginia. He married Charlotte Reeves. We know that he was among the very first to come here. He came probably as a long hunter into eastern Tennessee, and sometime around 1771, he and Charlotte and some other people from North Carolina, James Robertson and Charlotte Robertson, will decide to relocate into the corner of what you and I call Upper East Tennessee. Think about where Johnson City and Elizabethton are. We don't know exactly what prompted them. Some people say that James Robertson was a member of a group called the Regulators, who were citizens of North Carolina and South Carolina that wanted to regulate their taxes themselves. We have no evidence to prove that. But some people would say that these first people had been regulators who had been run out of North Carolina. But we have no documentation of this. But nonetheless, we know that James and Charlotte Robertson and several other people from North Carolina came in. Supposedly, James Robertson encountered William and Lydia Bean, who were from Virginia, who were already here. But what they set up are these settlements, these land claims, and James Robertson will be at one of these forts, the Watauga settlements. So James Robertson really realized they were on Indian land, and he and William Bean negotiated a treaty with the Cherokees to lease their land, probably about 1772. But now that you've got one group of people established here, more are going to want to come across the mountains and join them. And so you'll begin to see the population of these Watauga settlements really beginning to grow very, very rapidly. And among the people who come in a little bit later, probably about 1774 or 5, is John Sevier. He is a French Huguenot, Jean Sevier, but we call him John Sevier. And he gets there as well. Now, again, It's the land, folks. These people didn't come over here for religious reasons. They came because they saw opportunity. One of the people who really comes up with some great ideas here is a judge in North Carolina named Richard Henderson. Richard Henderson is a judge, but he's a land speculator, and he wants to make money. So Richard Henderson comes over to the Watauga settlements in 1775 and calls for a meeting of the Wataugans and the Cherokee leaders. So they meet at Sycamore Shoals on the Watauga River in March of 1775. Now, what is his purpose here, you might ask? Richard Henderson wants to buy a large piece of land from the Cherokees. Now, there are the English settlements up there in that corner, the corner of our state. They have set up a government. They are operating fairly well together. And here comes Richard Henderson, who now puts ideas into their head. If you have never been to Elizabethson's summer drama, you should go up there. They have a musical drama at Fort Watauga. It's really quite interesting. So this is what Henderson proposes to the Cherokee chieftains. I want to buy all of the land above the Cumberland River all the way to where the Green River flows into the Ohio River. So most of Middle Tennessee above the Cumberland River and central Kentucky. Now the Cherokees are very divided about this, and the Cherokees, you know, they have some decisions to make immediately because you're dealing with people that are more numerous than you, they have more weapons than you, and they've got more people coming than you've got anywhere that you can rally around to support you. So do you resist, or do you try to make the best deal possible? Do you try to come up with a compromise? So one of the Cherokee chieftains, Attakullakulla, who had been to Great Britain in 1730, he said, we need to compromise. After all, we don't live over there, and we don't really believe in private ownership of land, so let's let them have it. They're going to give us something in exchange for this. Let's let them have it, and maybe they'll leave us alone here on our tribal ancestral homelands. And so Attakullakulla and Nancy Ward, the beloved woman of the tribe, said, let's make a deal. Well, one of the Cherokee warriors, Aconistota, said, this is not a good idea. If you give them an inch, they will take a mile. Dragging Canoe strongly opposed this deal with Richard Henderson because he said, you know, this area is going to be absolutely covered with blood. And he was very adamant about it, so much so that the hostile Cherokees moved away from the tribal villages down to where the Nickajack River flows into the Tennessee River. As you're driving towards Chattanooga, you cross the Nickajack River there. Dragging Canoe and the hostile Cherokees left and went down there. But this is what Richard Henderson wanted to do. He didn't want to just buy this land. He wanted to create his own state. After all, William Penn had gotten a proprietorship to establish his own colony, Pennsylvania, so he wanted to be the proprietor of his colony across the woods, across the mountain, that he was going to name Transylvania. Now, if you listen to the Snowbird Report, and I don't think I heard it a single time this winter because we didn't really have any snow, but you know, they're listing the counties in Kentucky, and Transylvania County is a county in Kentucky, just a county, but it was named for Richard Henderson's proposed colony. He wanted to have his own colony, and then sell the land to people who came this way. And so that is approximately what the colony of Transylvania would have looked like. Now let's stop here for a minute. Did Richard Henderson have permission from Parliament to negotiate treaties with the Indians? No. Did he have any authority to be not only where he wasn't supposed to be in the first place, the Watauga settlements? None of them were supposed to be over here. But now you're talking about an even bigger enterprise. No, he had no permission. He did this of his own initiative. These people were people who were looking for opportunity, and certainly, indeed, it did seem like a wonderful opportunity, particularly when you factor in that the land here in our part of Middle Tennessee is so much better for farming than up in the northeastern corner of our state, and we've got all this game coming in and out. So this really looked like, to Henderson, a really wonderful opportunity. But, you know, a year from the time this treaty was signed, life between the colonies and Great Britain goes from bad to worse, and the colonies declare themselves to be independent. So the people over here are not really affected immediately by the outbreak of this war, but because North Carolina now sees these people as part of their state, North Carolina is going to eventually want some of these men to come and help them fight the British. When the British come, you know, Washington's biggest problem was keeping an army in the field because he had to rely on the states to provide their militias to fight in the Continental Army. So we don't know exactly what happened in the Watauga settlements when the Declaration of Independence was signed and the Revolutionary War began. But we do know that eventually Henderson is going to get a little bit antsy. And so Henderson comes up with an idea. It really doesn't matter who wins this war going on the eastern side of the Appalachians. I need to get settlers into my Transylvania. I need to get settlers there because the way that you claim land is to live on it and plant, you show that you're living on it by planting a corn crop. Now, another interested party that shows up in the Watauga settlements about this time in 1779 is John Donaldson. He came from Virginia, and he was the only one of the people that came over here to settle that actually had money from the beginning. He had several political positions in Virginia, but he saw this as a golden opportunity to make money through land speculation. Was there a risk involved? Well, yes, there was a great big risk because you don't know where you're going. But when James Robertson had come in and out of here as a long hunter, he hadn't really seen any native peoples. The others had not really seen native peoples, although some of the long hunters who had come into Sumner County, the Bledsoes and others, had encountered Indians and had actually had some fighting done with Indians before the settlement, but Robertson had not encountered native peoples here in the Cumberland settlements. So the plan is concocted. Henderson is going to hire James Robertson and John Donaldson to lead a migration of people from the Watauga settlements over to this spot that Robertson has identified as a perfect location for a settlement on the Cumberland River between where the Salt Creek and another creek come into the Cumberland. Then you can pick that area between those two creeks. You can identify it, and that will be where you put your settlement. So the plan was concocted that Robertson and a small party of, let's say, 10 or 12 men would come through the Cumberland Gaps, through central Kentucky, where there were some settlements there already, and come down to this spot that Robertson had identified on the Cumberland River. Donaldson agreed to lead what was referred to as a flotilla of flatboats. There's a wonderful documentary that Nashville's public television station did recently of John Guyder's trip down the Cumberland that tells you a lot about the Donaldson party. I highly encourage you to watch it if you haven't seen it. But the Donaldson party is going to come on a group of rafts, big, flat Tom Sawyer rafts, just bigger. And they are going to float down the Tennessee River. Now, the plan is in the beginning that James Robertson will leave first, and he will then come down to the Muscle Shoals and meet the Donaldson party. He will come that way, and that's just when the Donaldson party will end. But number one, it was the dead of winter. There's very little communication, none between Robertson and Donaldson after Robertson left. So Robertson leaves in October, and he comes up through across Kentucky. And this is amazing. Along the way, there'll be families out there in Kentucky just sort of looking for a place to live. And so Robertson apparently was a great salesman, because he says, well, we're going down to this place, we're going to settle on the Cumberland River. So this large swath of people, and we're talking about covering several miles, but there may be as many as 200 people with Robertson by the time he crosses the Tennessee-Kentucky line. And so they just sort of start falling off. Well, this looks like a nice place for me and our family. We'll stop here. We'll stop here in what becomes Sumner County, Robertson County. So he had a fairly large group. Robertson also has a large number of descendants here. And so Robertson's descendants say that James Robertson, with his son Jonathan and some animals, will camp on the eastern side of the Cumberland River on Christmas Eve. They will camp on the eastern side on Christmas Eve, Edgefield, over there about where the Titan Stadium is probably. And on Christmas Day, they will walk across the Cumberland River because it is frozen. Now, I do think they walked across the Cumberland River. I don't necessarily think that they had any clue as to what day of the week it was, whether it was Christmas or the 4th of July. Well, they weren't celebrating that, of course, then, were they? But the Robertson family lore says that they crossed the river, and of course they sent their animals first to make sure that the river was firm enough to walk on, and then the men crossed it and they settled here on Christmas Day. But Robertson went trying to find the Donaldson party, got caught in a snowstorm, didn't make it, and the Donaldson party had no one to meet them there, so the Donaldson party just had to keep going downstream. The trip of the Donaldson party was horrendous. The Chickamaugans, as those hostile Cherokees are now calling themselves, are down there in the Nickajack area, and so you're going to go right through their villages, and they are going to attack. They are going to do everything they can to keep you from going through with this. They are going to be determined, absolutely determined, that they are going to prevent this settlement from taking place. They get to the Muscle Shoals, and it is only a sheer miracle that they were able to get those rafts, which you really can't steer, flat boats, across those rocks, and then they get to the Ohio River. Now, Donaldson knows enough about this to know where the Salt Lick is, and he knows they're going to have to go up the Ohio River 10 or 12 miles to where the Cumberland flows into the Ohio, but then you're going to have to get these rafts up the Cumberland River to meet the Robertson party. Now, keep in mind that this is like March of 1780. James Robertson got here Christmas Day, 1779, and nobody knows who's alive where. And how do you get a flat boat up a river as wide and fast as the Ohio? You take a rope, you tie it to a tree upstream, and then you pull. And women, you're going to have to help. We're going to have to all be in this together. Pull till you get the boat up to that tree. Then you take your rope and you put it a little further down. And that is how they got here, April 24th, 1780. And there must have been a great reunion when they got here. And the Donaldson party, I'm sure, was actually quite surprised to see anybody here, and I'm sure that the Robertson clan that was here were also equally surprised. One day I was telling this story in one of my Tennessee history classes, and I said, can you imagine what a wonderful reunion it must have been when those women stepped off the boats into their arms of their husbands? And one of my female students said, well, you know what I would have said? Honey, when are you ever going to learn to read a map? So there weren't any maps. They had a clue as to what they were doing. That's the Salt Creek right there today. I was out in a boat on the river and took that picture, but that's where the Salt Creek is. And so what they found when they got here was nothing but trouble. Fierce Indian attacks as those Chickamauгans kept trying to keep the people from settling here. And so they had several years of Indian attacks so severe that the Donaldson family actually left after one of their sons was killed in an Indian attack in the Clover Bottom area. John Donaldson himself was killed by the Indians somewhere in Kentucky. It was a tremendous risk that these people took and put themselves and their children into great danger. But they did ultimately prevail and claim the land. Now, this is where we're going to stop today, because I know that you all have been very attentive, but you've been sitting here for an hour and 15 minutes. And I know that we really don't have any time left for questions and answers. But I think we might have time for one or two questions before the bell rings at 12:15. Does anybody have a question? Yes, sir.
We took a trip one time to Nova Scotia, and we heard up there that they were going to be the 14th state. Have you ever heard that story?
Nova Scotia? I have heard that indeed. I have, and they do tell that story there. They didn't make it, and neither did Transylvania. Yes, Nova Scotia thought they were going to become a state. Yes.
Early in your talk, you talked about Bell's Bend and you mentioned Nolensville Road.
Which goes south.
Okay, because I don't see them being anywhere near each other.
No, there were pockets. See,
okay.
Here we are in between. The pockets, that's a very good question. There were two separate regions of Middle Tennessee that were very strong dairy farming communities. They are not connected in any way. You've got downtown Nashville in between, but I don't think there are any dairy farms left in Middle Tennessee. One last question over here.
When you were talking about the Indian mounds, were they basically used as burial sites for the...
Primarily here, they were burial sites. There may have been some ceremonial activity on top of these mounds. These are a little bit different from the Cahokia mounds up in Illinois. If you've been to St. Louis and haven't gone across the river, there's a really wonderful site, the Cahokia Mound, so I encourage you to go up there if you're interested in that. And the state parks also have a site south of Jackson called the Pensive Mound, and they look at the Pensive Mounds as being a place where several groups of Indians came and traded, and they found things from the Great Lakes to Florida in the Pensive Mounds down south of Jackson. It's a very well done site. Well, if you have any questions, send me an email. I love hearing from you. Please feel free to send me an email. We will start with the 1780 signing of the Cumberland Compact next week. Thank you so much for your attention. I hope you have a good day. Thank you.
This has been a service of the Metro Nashville Network. If you would like to see this presentation again, or for more information about this and other programs, visit nashville.gov.